Okay, so Tenet is the director Christopher Nolan's most recent movie. Came out last year, 2020, in cinemas, and I think it was kind of the attempt to bring people back into the cinemas to come and watch this film. Didn't really do very well, I think partially because of COVID, but also because of the confusing nature of the film. But I really like it. I've seen it 3 times now. I saw it twice in cinemas. The first time I had no idea what was going on. I thought it looked visually very cool, but I didn't really understand any of it. But it wasn't the time stuff I didn't understand. It was the main plot details of which character is doing what and where they're going, etc. That was confusing. But looking back, I think that's probably due to this weird sound mixing, meaning that I couldn't understand some dialogue, which a lot of people have said, so I'm not the only one there. Then I saw it a second time in cinema, and I understood the plot a lot more after seeing it the first time, reading up on it a bit, and for some reason I think I was maybe paying attention a bit more to the dialogue when I rewatched it the second time, because I understood all of the simple plot details completely, well, pretty much. And so the second time I watched it, I went with a friend as well, and I really, really enjoyed it. And then the third time, watched it the other day on Blu-ray, so at home, not in the cinemas with the big booming sound system, although the Ludwig Göransson score was still very loud and bassy on the home speakers. Watched it again and really, really enjoyed it. I think every time I've watched the film, I've enjoyed it even more, even though visually it was the best in cinemas, because obviously the scale of the film. And I've come to really love it, actually. Just a warning, there will be spoilers in this video, by the way, so if you haven't seen it, then go watch it, then come back. But yeah, I've come to really love the film. And I think the main thing that I like about the film, really, is just the concept. It's a realistic and, well, as realistic as you can get, and interesting and different time travel movie that, most time travel films are, not very plausible or unrealistic, and tend to have a lot of paradoxes and loopholes, and you kind of end up figuring them out, and it kind of changes the way you view the movie. This film, even though there probably is ways to nitpick it and things like that, it seems very, very plausible, and I think that's one of the most appealing aspects of it. It's time travel in a realistic way, and obviously Nolan has said it's not time travel, and that's because it's not. It's time inversion, and objects' entropy, and eventually people, their entropy being reversed. It's very, very fun to watch this idea unfold on the screen in front of you, and I think the problem a lot of people had, and why it got some negative reviews, was that the same problem as I had when I first watched it, is that I didn't understand what the characters were doing, where they were going, what they were talking about, partially because of the sound, and I think that was the main problem, because visually it's stunning, and obviously the time stuff is still very confusing. After watching it a third time, I understand all of it now, apart from one section which I'm still a little bit unclear on, but I pretty much know what's going on. It's the car chase sequence, but I'm pretty sure I'm there now. I think it's just because of the temporal pincer movement that Sator runs, which is a bit confusing, and obviously the protagonist goes back as well, so it muddles it all up in my head. But yeah, I really love the film. The score is fantastic, honestly. Hans Zimmer is amazing in all of Nolan's films, but he's not. I don't really miss him here, to be honest. Ludwig Göransson's score is fantastic. Honestly, the bass in those songs coming out of my home speakers was so good. As I said, visually it's great. The bit that really gets me hyped up is when they're in the red and blue room and the protagonist inverts himself. That got me really excited the third time watching, because it was kind of, oh, here we go, the big stuff is about to happen. The final battle at the end is just amazing, and watching the behind the scenes on the film was really, really interesting, because there was a lot of behind the scenes that went into this film, obviously, because everything was done mostly in camera, because of the fact that Nolan prefers that practical approach. And with a film like this, that's very impressive. Obviously the actors having to learn how to look like they're walking forwards and really they're walking backwards, and look like they're walking backwards and really they're going forwards, and then filming that, and then filming the other version. Oh, the amount of time and effort it would have taken to get all this right is very, very impressive. I think the acting is all great. I think John David Washington is very, very good in this role. Kenneth Branagh ramps it up to the extreme, and I think it really, really works. Elizabeth Debicki is really good as Kat, actually a very emotional character, and I think one of the criticisms this film got is that it doesn't really have very emotionally investing characters, and for me, I understand that complaint, because you don't really know much about any of them, apart from Kat and Sator, until the end of the film. And so on a first time watch through, I kind of understand that complaint, but I think this film kind of has to be, be rewatched, and I think it's kind of meant to be. And so it doesn't really bother me, because when you rewatch it and you know all the characters' backstories, it's really interesting watching that. Like when you watch Neil, for example, knowing from the very beginning that he has known the protagonist for a lot longer than the protagonist has known him, and the subtle hints that he knows him. And I think he's a really interesting character, and at the end, obviously, he sacrifices himself. Kat is obviously very emotional. Priya is a quite interesting character. I do think that they're maybe not the characters with the most depth, but for me, the plot is so cool and interesting that it doesn't bother me too much, and there's enough there for me to connect and still be invested into what happens to these characters. Like, I'm still sad Neil dies. The only reason that it doesn't hit me massively hard is because I know the whole thing is a massive time loop, and the protagonist who we've been following will still have a lot of time with Neil in his future, but Neil's past. So that's why Neil's death, even though it's very sad, doesn't bother me as much as it maybe would do if it wasn't a time version film, because we know that Neil has more time with the protagonist. But I guess you could say that is an argument for they're not like good characters, but I don't know, I think they are. I think it works for the film they're in. It's such a complicated idea that it kind of does kind of put plot first, and for me that's fine because I think the plot is great. So I just want to quickly talk about the theory that Neil is Max, is Kat's son, but from the future. It was CinemaWins' videos that pointed this out, to me anyway. I hadn't heard of this theory before then, talking about this theory, and I think that it's very, very cool, but it's almost too implausible to kind of agree with, because the film itself, even though it approaches everything in a very realistic manner, partially because it just goes with the theory of, well, not the theory, the statement of what's happened has happened, and so it doesn't try to explain the kind of fate element. It just kind of says, it is what it is, what's happened has happened, and so it kind of has plausibility, even though in real life it probably isn't that plausible a theory at all. But the fact, saying that Neil could possibly be Max, for me is just a little bit too much of a stretch, because he would have had to have inverted himself for like 10 years. Again, it was CinemaWins that pointed this out, and it doesn't seem plausible, inverting yourself for 10 years. It kind of pushes the bounds of reality. But if you want to believe that, that's fine. If Nolan suddenly came out and announced that Neil was Max from the future, he just was waiting for enough people to see it before he announced it, then I'd be fine with that, and I'd actually really enjoy the theory. So I think it's a very cool one and a very interesting one, and kind of one that seems quite obvious. But for me personally, at the moment, I don't view him as Max, because it just, inverting yourself for 10 years, a few days or like a week is plausible because it happens in the film, but 10 years is just, I don't know, I guess it could be possible. Believe what you want to believe is what I'll say, but for me personally, I don't really look at that. But overall, I would give Tenet a 4 out of 5. That may surprise some people. It may be a little bit too high, but for me personally, I loved rewatching this film. I'm going to rewatch it again soon. I think the whole concept is fascinating. I think the characters have enough depth for me to be satisfied, and I think they have more depth than people are giving them credit for. It just kind of happens at the end, so you have to rewatch it, which could be a negative, but for me, I don't think it is. A movie isn't a one-time experience. You can rewatch it over and over and over again. And with a film like this, I think you kind of have to. So, yeah, I love Tenet. 4 out of 5. I think it's a very decent film. I think, even though a lot of people say it's one of Nolan's weaker films, and compared to the others it probably is, it's still a very good film. And for me, it's slowly becoming one of my favourites. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Please leave a comment, subscribe, comment if you've subscribed, and wait for my 2 videos next week. The second one will be on Zack Snyder's Justice League, or the Snyder Cut. I watched Man of Steel the other night. I'm going to be watching Batman vs Superman Ultimate Edition again soon, so I can prepare for that, because it's going to be interesting. I'm not a massive Snyder fan, but I enjoyed Batman vs Superman Ultimate Edition enough. Man of Steel is decent. So it's going to be interesting, but I'm going to be reviewing that, so look out for that.